but I can't really in this case. But okay. First, I'm going to talk about the comparative, right? I think you have two options. First, either you recognize like the former prime minister who the government has structurally destroyed, who's in fucking exile, who you have no ability to like negotiate with, who has like no sort of like connection to these people anymore, or you have no diplomatic relation. We think that both of these instances are pretty like brain dead because they antagonize, they prevent any sort of ability for you to actively like send aid, to coordinate, to open any level of like communication channel. And what that does is it increases some degree of like risk when it comes to like the Taliban feeling antagonized and antagonizing some degree of like conflict. It decreases your ability to scale up resources or like to coordinate to some extent, right? Why do we care about like Afghanistan as like a strategic center, right? One, I think there are significant like border like risk security concerns when it comes to things like Pakistan, when it comes to things like ensuring that trade is ongoing, when it comes to things like ensuring that that there's active like mobility of people, i.e. Just making sure that people who had to like flee during these times are able to kind of get back or are able to like see those things. But second, you also care about it because of the presence of other actors that are likely to be pernicious, i.e. like Iran, in the absence of the international community at large, recognizing the existence of the Taliban and being able to coordinate it with it as the government of Afghanistan. It is probably likely that you get significantly worse sort of like proxies that actively have incentives that are probably going to be worse. I think the functional relationship that you have with them is the majority of this debate. It's not about the optics of recognizing it, it's about the extent to which you actively are able to coordinate. Okay. Second, this isn't necessarily about the West, it's about the general sort of analysis of governments and how they're probably going to do. Why? Okay. The unstable Afghanistan is just a breeding ground for things like fundamentalist sort of like Islamic groups. I think what this means is that you actively have like threats within the region, and you probably aren't able to like negotiate to the same extent that we are. Why is this true, and why is negotiation good? First, you ensure necessary access to things like the World Bank, right? Notice that these like central bank-like reserves that America literally stole from these people, that like the vast majority of the world already agrees with, that the Afghani people feel like are theirs. These are things that you actively like reintroduce into these groups through like coordinating with the Afghani government, right? These are things that actively you are able to reintroduce, and these are things that you get on our side, right? Why is the functional relationship good? One, it means that they enter things like the UN and international organizations and sort of like security things that you get on our side of the house, which means that you have some degree of international security, right? What that looks like is democratic like mechanisms that you get on our side of the house, rather than any sort of backwashing, any sort of like risk of kind of like randomness and like resorting to like violence as a whole, right? Why is it in the incentive of the Taliban to like engage with these mechanisms to some extent and to like democratically like participate or at least coordinate and open some degree of communication channels on our side of the house? One, I think they don't actively want the risk of like other countries occupying or having like a presence, or even like internal sort of like risks of that, right? The reason is that like the like fear and like the association of like literally having their people like dismembered and like murdered by security forces. This isn't about like the plausibility of things, of something like another like American invasion, but rather about the risk and the perceptual fears that exist and the ability to weaponize this risk that often that exists within the Taliban sort of like narrative, and how you prevent that. And I think that to some extent on our side of the house, you do get engagement with like greater state forces at large, right? What that means is that like the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, okay, when you have things like cases of conflict, it is you allow for things like the flow of people into regions without like a perceptual sort of fear that these are people that are like being reintroduced as like American sort of like threats, or being reintroduced that actively have to be like killed, for example, right? There's an incentive to just avoid like greater sort of systemic dismantling. I think what that means that you can actively sort of like prevent things like coordinations with like Iran, which thrive in chaos, which have an active incentive to diffuse things like American or like Western resources at large, and probably profit or like to some extent benefit off of this like degree of instability, whether it be like economically or for like world like motives at large. I'll take a few from opening.
Yeah, so like the Taliban fought off the world's two greatest powers ever. Why are they uniquely concerned with like security concerns?
Yeah, okay, one, I think there's just Afghani pressure like locally to be able to care about these things, whether it be like just the fact that people just want access to like a base level of resources, right? Notice that this is also long-termist like in nature, right? So the fact that people are literally dying on the ground and don't necessarily like don't like recognize this, but two, they probably don't want to continue fighting off the entire world for like the rest of existence, right? Notice that they have to engage in some sort of like long-term model, whether it be like this is a government that has been internationally sort of like recognized as like legitimate. They actively have to live up to like the legitimacy of that, right? I think at that point they practically have to like coordinate with efforts and they're probably not going to continue down this like antagonizing model because it's just so like short-lived on your side. You have to prove why that's like likely to happen and going to be successful. I'll take closing.
Given your framing that the West has no ability to control what's going on in Afghanistan unless we do this, why is the Taliban worried about us going into Afghanistan and doing the things you're talking about?
Okay, 2 reasons. One, I think there's just that even if this risk doesn't exist, there is a perceptual ability to say that this is a risk that exists when you're not engaged within international institutions that give you the accountability mechanisms to say, no, actually you are in an international channel that has told you about every single thing that America is doing within this region. I think these sorts of reasons present a level of accountability where the Taliban just can't operate out of fear of, oh, this is Western imposition. No, they're actively coordinating, right? But two, they actively do see and face internal sort of risks and conflict, right? They have beef with other Islamic fundamentalists within that region, right? They actively do have resistance within within the region. They probably do, and I think to some extent what this means is that you legitimize the Taliban sort of long-term stability by reducing the risk of local sort of uprising, in turn for them actively allowing for people to exist in relatively greater peace, right? What does that mean you get on our side of the house, right? And what's the benefits of skill and coordination? First, I think that the Taliban is more aware of literally what is going on within the region. You actively facilitate information going forward. But that means that when you reintroduce economic stimulus, you can do it en masse, right? You can scale up a lot of these resources and you can coordinate in a way that the average person on the ground is likely to be able to access to a greater extent. But that means that you can invest in things that are probably much more long-term in nature, whether it be roads, infrastructure, mobility, whatever. What that means is that also the fact that you just have things like central bank reserves or access to the World Bank means that you have less risk of falling back to the bottom line, which is just complete sort of an utter chaos and violence. Notice that the greatest degree of human right violations probably happen when there is no sort of economic model of stability, where there's no guarantee of future rights. What this does is at least promises that to some extent when you're engaging internationally that you will have access to resources that will prevent you from falling later down the line. That gives some incentive and some sort of trust in this region. That's how you get international investment, and that's actively how you allow for safety on the ground.
Panel, there's a reason why Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires. It's because literally every major power since pretty much the 1800s has tried to invade and conquer Taliban, Afghanistan, and has been repelled by the local people. I think this is important to note because I don't think external force intrusion is something that the Taliban is uniquely concerned about in this debate. One, it's unclear who would be the one doing this. They're going to have to, government teams would have to give pretty strong reasons why any of the regional actors would actively do this, insofar as there's honestly, quite frankly, not that much there for them to want. Again, the Americans went in with NATO allies for democratic reasons. They'll need to name a state that's going in for other reasons. I think this is important because then I think what probably matters most in this debate is to some degree much more recognition and high level stuff. And this is important because that's actually the basis of this debate. And note that they're trying to frame it away from that because this is where they obviously are going to lose ground. But I think this is important because actually recognition doesn't do that many things that they're trying to tell you. I want to note that membership in the WTO is not based off recognition, right? You don't need to be recognized. Good example of this, Taiwan. Everyone trades with Taiwan. Everyone has open relationships with them. Literally only 13 countries, actually 12 now recognize them. It was Nauru who switched its vote 2 months ago kind of thing. Also, I want to note is things like the UN, one, don't necessarily one, don't require you to make any of the changes that they're talking about. There's a lot of non-democratic, a lot of authoritarian, a lot of human rights abusing states in the UN, so it's unclear why any of that would matter. And just I think let's just get this out of the way so we have a clean debate. One, you can just not recognize anyone. Libya doesn't have formal recognition. Places like Somaliland doesn't have formal recognition. You can still do practices with them. You can still do a bunch of stuff. Literally, diplomatic recognition at its fundamental basis is a symbolic move, and I think that's what this debate is actually about. They can talk about things like investment and stuff, but those things can happen, outside of those types of things. I'll explain why uniquely the types of investment you have are far better when you don't recognize them, because you're much less likely to have MNCs and other actors involved, rather than governments who can make their aid far more conditional. And I'll also say, we aren't opposed to eventually someday recognizing the Taliban, but I think they need to take the steps that the most of the world would like them to see, which is to have better human rights, to recognize women's stuff, basic rights and things like that kind of thing. But importantly, you don't give them the carrots before they've done any of the types of things, right? And I think this is important. I'm going to characterize uniquely what the Taliban cares about, but I think it's largely recognition, right? Again, this is a group that fought major powers to a standstill for decades on end, right? Like all through the 80s and all through the 80s with the Soviet Union, and pretty much all for the 21st century with the U.S. This is critical because this isn't a place that's like these are people and actors uniquely concerned about like economic stuff. And to be honest, I don't think they care that much about what their people go through, insofar as they probably would have capitulated to the U.S. a long time ago if that was their primary concern, or Soviet Union, or any of the other invading forces. This is critical because recognition is the #1 thing they care about, i.e. when you give up your largest bargaining chip to them without any concessions on their side, you're unlikely to get any of the meaningful changes from your side. I want to note that obviously the obvious response that will probably get flippantly from CG on this is like, oh, well, can't you just like withdraw recognition at some point? I want to note that one doesn't really happen. The main thing that they want to do is like, usually countries do this all at once, like no one's withdrawn recognition of China after human rights abuses after they switched over to them. Countries rarely ever do this. Once you give it one, you rarely ever go back. And even if you do, it's like the main thing they want is that initial thing that they can then be recognized because it allows them, it legitimizes them initially. So you obviously as the main bargaining chip that you have, and then this debate just becomes like a when you recognize them. I don't think that's much necessarily the point of the debate until they've taken substantial measures to treat their people better. We don't. But two other things just quickly that I think are important for this round. This is obviously like limited to actors who would obviously like this is like conceivable for like the U.S. is not going to recognize the Taliban tomorrow. Very unlikely. Western actors are unlikely to recognize the Taliban. They fought a war with them. They violate all their charters. All that types of things. We're probably talking about middle powers, i.e. countries in the middle. I want to note no other BRICS country has done this. The leaders in the region haven't done this. India hasn't done this. Brazil hasn't done this. All these countries haven't done this. One, finally, quickly, like China hasn't done this. China has done this. Who gives a shit? A lot of countries trade with Taiwan and do stuff with Taiwan. Doesn't matter. I think it's important. I can out-speculate on China if people want to go there, but I don't think we want. Okay, characterizing the modern-day Taliban. The first thing I want to note is like they actually don't really need much of the economic potential benefits that they're going to claim you think. What they largely want is to legitimize their rule, and not legitimize their rule like because the people aren't buying in, and suddenly like if the UN recognizes them, people would buy in. Like unfortunately, they kind of have the people kind of under the gun. What they need to do is legitimize their own rule because they want to feel legitimacy. Like again, you don't fight as part of a caliphate for decades like without having those things that you want. The main thing they want to do is be recognized as an Islamic republic over Afghanistan, and that's the one thing that they care most about, i.e. the main chip you have one. I think it's a bit laughable that they talk about, they have concerns about like harboring terrorists and fostering a breeding ground for Islamist treaty. It's like, I'm sorry, it's the fucking Taliban, that's what they are. I'm not sure why having a government that literally is like jihadist in nature is good in any sort of way, so it's unclear why that like gets better. I think it's probably easier to foster like those types of things when you legitimize that state and people can travel there much more easily, because these are the types of things that happen with diplomatic relations. It's far easier for people to get passports and recognition on those grounds, and those are the types of things that happen. So if they care about stuff. Finally, nobody's fucking coming back to Afghanistan. Like this idea of movements of people like fleeing Afghanistan to come back. I'm sorry, if you can get out of Afghanistan now, you probably have, and you're probably going to whatever country you think you have the safest chance. So I don't think those are the types of things. I also don't think like the benefits of like closing those borders or anything. Like I think people have the right to flee like an autocratic ruler. That's not anything. So why do we have the better ability to negotiate them, and why will we have a better chance? First of all, I just want to note that conditionality of aid is far easier to do when you haven't diplomatically recognized them, i.e. there aren't the access of tendencies and other things that do require that diplomatic access. You're more able to leverage your position as government to say, hey, in order for you to get this aid, in order for you to get this kind of stuff, we uniquely need you to do X, Y, and thing. You need to let in these organizations to verify. That type of stuff does not happen when you have more open trade and more open access to things like that. Go ahead.
To the extent that you mitigate the benefits of this because it is not associated with normalized relations, trade deals, acceptance into international organization, it's also not a particularly good bargaining chip in a country that doesn't get any outside media, so it doesn't even matter on a narrative level.
So to be a very clear thing, like this is going to be a large round no matter what. Inherently, diplomatic recognition to some extent is one of those things. They can explain where they think these massive impacts are going to accrue, but insofar as a lot of things that at least opening up, and I'm looking forward to see what closing up is talked about, aren't things that are tied inherently to diplomatic recognition. I actually think those things are matter. What does matter is things like being in the UN Assembly and stuff like that, which is one, again, a legitimizing force that we think is probably bad. We don't think it's good that they probably have a say, that they're allowed to, again, have open access to speak, like this is why Saddam was saying, but also access to those things doesn't protect them in any way. So it's not a bargaining chip. Like, I'm sorry, Saddam Hussein spoke at the UN Assembly and then got invaded a couple months later. So it's unclear why the Taliban cares about those things for any protection. They care about it largely for symbolic reasons, and we tell you uniquely we want to stop this for symbolic reasons. And the only way we get the concessions we want, or sorry, not the only way, the best chance at these concessions. No one can prove inherently the Taliban will become more liberalized or improve in any way, but this is the best option you have because it's one of the few bargaining chips you have remaining available to you, and you should utilize it to the best extent. Insofar as this is a normative round, we think like the people of Afghanistan deserve better, and the world should work together to make sure that we limit the ability of other countries to, of them to force their own people. Very proud to
I'm gonna start my time in 3, 2, 1. Okay, first just want to point out that it's kind of insane that OG is like, oh, like they're really worried that if we don't diplomatically recognize that they'll get invaded, but also they don't worry about being diplomatically recognized. There's no reason why they want that to happen. They've already given you one. I think it's an insane one, but if they believe it, then they have to believe they care about getting diplomatically recognized. Here's 4 more reasons why the Taliban cares about getting diplomatically recognized. First, they've just said it. Again, this is like a debate thing where like it's just the reality. I don't know, like structural reasons I'll try and give you, but it's just the reality. 2, they've literally had de facto control of Afghanistan for the last 10 years. Like sure, there was like a US government, but like no one gave a fuck. They had no control. So the Taliban already had a lot of tangible, like the control things that they theoretically want on their side of the house. What they care about now is being the government of the state, being legitimized, that kind of thing. That's that's their express preference through the fact that they like bothered to continue to fight the Americans when they already had de facto control. Third reason, it's just part of their ideology of their version of Islam that it's a kingdom of God on earth. Like it's literally a like jurisdiction of space that is yours. That's just part of what they think. Fourth, what they said already. And then fifth, the Taliban has literally made PR concessions already. When they give public statements, they say things like, oh, we respect women's rights like within Sharia law, or like, oh, we're like working on like all these kinds of things. They literally say that because they care about how the West and other actors view them. What we need to do then is force them to actually fulfill these PR promises that they've made, but not just saying like, oh cool, you said you give a shit about women, so we'll give you this recognition now, and have nothing else to bargain with you about in the future. We need to maintain this that they want, the thing that they want, to ensure they actually live up to those things. Alright, next piece of refutation about opening government. First of all, their entire case contingents on it being true that you get more access to resources, communication, etc. on their side of the house. They have not proven this. Number one, we've given you several examples of why you can still have things like engaging with other countries, like in other ways, right? Like NGOs exist, and we give you a lot of examples of places where there are sort of meaningful things like resource exchange, etc. that happen on our side of the house. Importantly, these happen better on our side of the house because there are much more likely to be things like tied aid from NGOs that will only provide you aid if you meet certain conditions. Or if that aid is going to go specific projects like building a well, for example, versus trade with like a country that usually means like, oh, we buy your goods, which you could then use to do a bunch of bullshit. This is the second response to this argument, which is like, what are the resources actually going to do on their side? So even in their very best situation where this results in more resources going into Afghanistan, why is that also not good? First of all, the Taliban's like a armed group. Like they're spending a lot of money, for example, doing things like fighting ISIS in Afghanistan. Cool, they're gonna buy a bunch more fucking guns. They literally do like massive opium production, which involves like a ton of resource input to like make poppies grow and shit, right? They're also like literally going to use this money to do things like oppress women and like enforce like the police force, right? So when I talk about stealing what's been stolen from the Afghani people, I think that's really fucked up. You're literally giving their money back to their oppressors to like continue to oppress them. I think that's not like reparations in any meaningful way. That's really, really bad actually. The comparative is much better because you're much more likely to get very targeted aid and things that are happening to very specific projects that actually probably help people. As opposed to on their side of the house, if you're going to be opening these floodgates, you get things like corporations who don't give a fuck where their money is going, who are going to be trying to invest in these places, because right when you say like this is a legitimate actor and company, that means like your country's corporations can now go into that place. That's going to provide a lot of things that are really bad. I'll take PY from Becca. Go ahead.
I think your version of recognition is like Michael Scott saying he declares bankruptcy to declare bankruptcy. Feasibly, like the Infoslide is not saying Xi Jinping said the Taliban is legit government. He acknowledged an actual ambassador. Please acknowledge this debate actually involves real impacts.
I think we've given you a whole bunch of real impacts. Like, again, I think OG tried to frame it as like we only care about the symbolic thing. We tell you that the Taliban is specifically invested in the symbolism of diplomatic recognition, which is what makes it such a powerful tool. That then leads to all these practical impacts. Like again, if they want us to pretend we're only talking about symbolism, it's about what kind of resources get allocated to the Taliban. It's about how those resources are tied to specific projects. It's about what kind of like channels you have, those kinds of things. That's really important. Last response on this argument is that I think, and Karel talks about this, the cultural stability and endorsement of the Taliban is bad. First of all, I think it's a problem that they say like, oh, we don't give a shit that like if like women like don't have rights, we like endorse bad actors all the time. Cool. It's still bad to endorse bad actors. I think that's just an objectively bad thing. You shouldn't legitimize a government that does bad things like this. But specifically, the cultural stability of Taliban is bad. The more you have people saying that this is a legitimate like ruler of this land, the more you have things like, for example, people in their individual communities enforcing the Taliban's ideology. A lot of what happens in terms of Taliban like oppression isn't like a Taliban guy coming to your community to beat you up. It's like your neighbor's husband beating you up because you weren't like honoring your family, because the Taliban is viewed as the legitimate government governing force of this place, and their rules are legitimately imposed upon you. The more you enforce these things, the more you get things like women being, like violence against women, etc. Even marginal changes in this are very bad. Like, women's lives are really important, and they're on the line in this motion, and the more you say, like, we're just going to let this happen and endorse those things is really, really negative. Go ahead.
The problem with your shift of how the Taliban is going to engage if we hold it out is it's incompatible with the actual source of legitimacy. They don't care about getting legitimacy from the West or the United States. They care about getting it from God. The reality is that their things like their human rights abuses are enshrined in their legitimacy, and that's why they will never change, because that's their conception of how the world should be.
Cool. So again, that's Patrick telling me what the Taliban wants. I gave you 5 reasons before why the Taliban has already conceded things, at the very least in like saying they will concede things. Why would they give a shit if they didn't care about this? Like, literally, why would they ever engage with, why would they ever hold a press conference? Why would they ever engage with other countries if they didn't care about this legitimacy? There is like every action the Taliban has taken, including continuing to fight the Americans while they were occupying them, has shown this matters. They can just keep saying it doesn't, but that's not how it works. Part of their ideology of like the kingdom of God, also true, we also already dealt with that in terms of religion. Okay, why is it bad to have the Taliban in the UN? Like, let's talk about this quickly. Like, having the Taliban, for example, be able to vote on something like the UN Human Rights Commission is fucking insane and really scary. Like, the idea that the Taliban has a voice, even just to say fucked up shit about human rights, I think is negative, especially when you often have like slim margins on things. Like, while China was like kind of in control of the Human Rights Commission, like through Cambodia, there were a lot of really slim votes where like things passed like by very narrow margins, and sometimes one vote makes a difference. Lots of decisions in the GA, for example, are often made by like 2/3 majorities or even consensus, like the Sustainable Development Goals. When you undermine that, even that like concept of like international solidarity, I think you get a lot of big problems. Again, you have the Taliban spokespeople in these rooms saying really insane shit. They get a global platform to be like, yeah, women shouldn't like go to school or receive basic education. That's kind of fucked up. You can shake your head about it, but like, I don't want to watch someone on a podium tell me I don't deserve an education and go to school. Why would we give them this when it doesn't provide tangible benefits to those people? We shouldn't give them money with which to continue to oppress women. We can more effectively fund things that help people and coordinate on our side of the house. You do not gain benefits that are going to benefit like the world, and you definitely don't get benefits that are going to help Afghani people on their side of the house. Very, very proud.
Opposition really stands for, because on the one hand, they try to take a sort of nothing stance, that there's no difference in trade whatsoever, and because we can do all completely normal, we can send diplomats, we can have trade like we do with Taiwan, and all of this shit, and it's literally just saying the words we see was legitimate. But on the other hand, they're worried about what the effect of like money going into the country and being used to fund like oppressing women. I have no idea what the fuck they believe in. I'm going to take on a reasonable stance, and my intuition is just this. Read the Infoslide. Does the Infoslide say Xi Jinping said the magic words and that's what we care about? Or does it say that he like took on ambassadors and they're actually going to do relationships? Like, seriously, people, for the love of God, that seems like a more reasonable debate to be having. The other thing is just to note how insane it is that they think people saying things about Afghanistan internationally will affect legitimacy inside Afghanistan. And no, it's not because they get legitimacy from God. It's because people in Afghanistan don't have access to like foreign media telling them that the US said that they're legitimate. So as far as they know, the Taliban can just tell them this and they'll believe it anyways. Like, I think the control that the Taliban has over messaging means that no symbolic messaging within the country is going to make or break legitimacy when the Taliban can do that anyways. So I think then if we want this debate to be real at all, we kind of need to accept that probably this is going to involve doing things like increasing diplomatic relationships in a real and meaningful way, as the Infoslide suggests, actually having a much greater integration on trade, having like, trade organizations that collaborate with people. I'll say that, even the examples of Taiwan, I would argue that like, even if they don't say the magic words, the governments act like they recognize them as an autonomous region that they seem like they would protect in the future. I think that is an approximation of recognizing their legitimacy, which is generally what we stand for. I just want to make sure this debate is going to be like reasonably clean based on this. Okay. The next thing I just want to note on the Taliban is that, well, like O says, the Taliban is evil. I actually don't think they're beyond reproach or are completely incapable of benefiting their own people. And let's note that the Taliban has actually moderated to a significant quantity in the last 20 years, but people just don't recognize it because of how bad they still are. That is to say, 10 years ago, if you were to have a record in Afghanistan, you could be executed. But now the Taliban operates like radio channels where you can like listen to music on the air. The people, like women, are allowed to wear hijabs instead of burqas. There's like all these types of things that are actually dramatic leaps from where they used to be, as they had to occupy city centers with much more liberal people and adapt to some extent to gain support of people so that you see this legitimate. It's worth noting that like the assumption that the Taliban just does not care what people think about them, doesn't care about providing social services, is actually just delusional. Even the most dictatorial regimes on earth spend tons of money on propaganda and still do basic services. Like the Taliban literally took over the bureaucracy of Afghanistan, does provide some aspect of social services to people because they need to prevent revolts from happening and internal resistance which happens absent that type of action. So yeah, obviously they care about providing for the people much like every other country does, and they've demonstrated a capacity to be motivated to do better, which is critical in understanding why it might be possible to persuade them, which we're going to show you. The real problem is that their economy is in shambles, and not just about fear, but they lack the knowledge to run a country, right? These are people that have previously spent 20 years fighting a war, and this is all they know how to do, and now they have to worry about like the plumbing and the electricity systems and shit like that, and they just don't have the competence to do this well, even though they actually want to. This is why normalizing relations are so important, because if you have countries like China, for example, opening relations with them, maybe sending in businesses that are going to do operations within Afghanistan, you get strong incentives for those countries that are engaging in that cooperation to want the well-being of Afghanistan. That is to say, absent cooperation, people don't really give a shit about whether or not Afghanistan has nice roads or clean drinking water or whatnot. But if you want to build a factory there, then the fact that there's roads going to like the major airports and stuff like that actually begin to matter to you, and the likelihood that you get investment, but also collaborate with the government to provide intellectual labor, like your experts from your country can go there and help them develop road projects, for example, are things that the Taliban wants to do because it enriches themselves, because they'll be able to both help people. Like people want the roads and clean drinking water in their country. The Taliban wants it because A, it increases support amongst their people who are now happier, but also it's very good for trade, which means they get richer independently. And all this, and foreign countries now want it because of their now normalized relations that allow them to profit off of the development of the country, which absent some degree of enhanced cooperation, you would never get to a meaningful degree. So I think that this means that through this type of cooperation, and so you get strong economic incentives to do things that enrich the people of Afghanistan. I would also note that even on the way, right, even if you think, and I'll note that you can make more of these things contingent, but the problem is that if you don't have strong normalized relations with them, it's very difficult to know what the Taliban value or are willing to make concessions on. The Taliban is somewhat unpredictable, very conservative, a lot of governments don't necessarily know what exactly they can demand of them in sanctions that they'll be willing to trade off with. So if you don't have strong negotiations where you're constantly able to figure out what do they need on the ground, what are they willing to budge on in terms of human rights violations, if that's what we care about, then just blanket sanctions and saying we're not going to give you anything until you recognize, but not actually talking with them, having ambassadors that can do that type of negotiations, means you're going to be highly unsuccessful in being able to get any of the changes within the country that you want, which probably means that you're much less effective at being able to do that. Yeah, Schulte, top hat.
Yeah, so if your main benefit is just like the ability to talk, note that the US government literally met with the Taliban in Qatar to negotiate their withdrawal, so why do you have to need diplomatic relations to do any of this?
Comparative thing, right? Like, I really think that if you want to watch the debate into nothing, that's fine. But Infoslide says this about having more ambassadors. You have a much, much worse degree of doing this when it's not normalized relations, or when the government doesn't feel like you're advocating in good faith. That at any moment, for example, you might work with like an adversary to overthrow them, for example, and I just don't think that you're actually going to be able to get the degree of collaboration, which means on the margin, the efficacy of what you're doing is less bad. Also just note that the fact that there just haven't been anything like trade deals, for example, that are often contingent on this, indicate that you don't have a foreign business going in, even though it'd be very profitable. Sure, I'll take a point.
Given your bench's stance that the Taliban's really fearful of increased US intervention and influence, why are they likely to normalize relationships with the West?
Not necessarily about the West, right? There's also, it's just as countries, so it could be China or whatever. But we think that there's probably a degree of competition. But the key thing that unifies all of those that want to do business in Afghanistan is interest in a country that is A, stable, and B, built with a sufficient infrastructure to enable business interests to be met. These are both in the interest of international commerce and trade, but also very much in the interest of the people of Afghanistan. Because even if the Taliban is shit, if for 20 years your most proximate concerns are being murdered in a bombing or starving to death because your economy is in shambles and your basic ability to function is not that significant. Obviously, being able to dress how you want and listen to music or whatever are important concerns, but they are comparably less important than people's most proximate concern, which is staying alive and having their most fundamental basic needs met, which we think is comparatively more likely with economic prosperity within the Afghanistan. I really think the problem that they have is one of solvency. That is to say that for the past 20 years, people have been trying to put in a better regime that they like better than the Taliban, despite billions of dollars of effort and massive military intervention. We have failed to get any sort of government in Afghanistan that was more successful and stable than the Taliban. What that means is that I'm sort of unclear about the world that they hope to get, right? I don't know if they offer this essentially nothing stick if they're going to get any sort of benefits. Whereas at least you can believe that in a world where the Taliban is likely to be in power anyways, one where there's heavy investment from other countries and aligned incentives to develop their economy because they have normalized relations, is a much better one for the people of Afghanistan. For that reason, very proud to propose.
3, 2. The fundamental reality that opposition has to broach with is that the Taliban is not going anywhere, and we have to deal with them as they are. And that is why they failed this motion. I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to go first go through opening opposition, then go through closing. Actually, start closing, opening, and then I'll be waiting. So let's start with closing. They said they were derivative, but they said a whole lot of nothing. Let me go through it. The first thing that they told us is that all of you NATO will hate this, and it will undermine their ability to do a bunch of different kinds of actions, United States, etc. The first thing is it's unclear what the connection is between recognizing legitimacy in state and your operations as a, for example, large organization that has multi-purpose and has a lot of defense interests, most of them that exist in borders that are not even in this Middle Eastern section. The second thing is that it is just factually incorrect that the United States is not able to have a dual perspective. They literally fought a war with Vietnam, they fought a war in Korea, and then they proceed to recognize the states that literally beat the shit out of them and killed so many American troops. It is then clear that the implication of this and the mechanism behind this is that there is an ability to move on over time. That is, yes, we could suggest and agree that there may be some temporary backlash, and if they want to try to run on temporary backlash, it's the most awful argument that never wins. And the reason why is because it's something that is temporally proximate, does not exist for a very long time. The benefits of the Taliban people are far more than, for example, a very angry Republican being like, I hate the Taliban. You know what I mean? Like, this is something they already are going to be doing anyways. So to that extent, the real thing that becomes that their mechanisms are reliant on this being more than a news flash, which it probably will not be. Secondly, I think that time passes and things get disconnected. People don't feel as strongly about this topic anymore and probably think that at this point, this is probably a better channel to get the liberal interests that they want, and so that's something that they could see as a better alternative. Lastly, this motion, as characterized by opening opposition, is of relative recognition. That means that it's not about necessarily all states acting in a uniform capacity. They said the United States, and they're knifing their OO, by the way, has to recognize and be like, we're best buds, we're opening up an embassy, we're going to do everything in the most uniform way. This motion is not every country uniformly has ambassadors and recognize them. It's relative. Clearly the countries that are not going to like to do it as much are not going to be doing it. Not right now. So I think we take out this point on this weird NATO point, and they also say that countries that recognize NATO, that are not part of NATO, are now going to be shunned by NATO, which is so strange because countries always have different kinds of underlying political interests and allyships. Some countries are allies with both with China and they're allies with the United States, and yet they're still able, like for example Turkey, to for example still be inside NATO. This is a ridiculous point. So we cleared that out of the debate. Next, they say that there's going to be back channels for resistance groups, which by the way, this is probably the most insane point I think I could hear in this round. More resistance in fucking Afghanistan, a country where you've chronically failed by OOs, they just try to knife OO the whole time. OO says that you failed, this is literally the graveyard of empires, yet they suggest, guys, the best thing for a country that's been destabilized, the people have been dying, is more destabilization and more death, which is obviously not a good alternative. Perceived stability by recognition of diplomatic means that we make the government stronger, and that means that there's less likely to be them encroaching on their own people and addressing them in hard ways because they're going to be less afraid of this type of encroachment. It's actually on their side of the house things get worse, because in the state of perpetual fear, in the state of we don't know what our own people are doing because they could be spies for the United States because we don't have formal recognition channels, which means that they might do and incur in the same way they say, this is where you encroach on the rights of people more, where you shut down on them. That is a bad outcome that we don't possibly want on their side of the house. So to that extent, one, I think you get more types of encroachments on people's rights and shut down in the fear of not knowing anything and not knowing based on recognition. And two, I think that their alternative has no solvency. They don't prove why resistance groups are necessarily good and why more war in the chance of liberalization is better than the alternative that Jacob uniquely provides, which is that of economic connections and the type of solvency you get, for example, from European Union, because when you have the types of economic relations, it means that you leverage that types of ties in order to liberalize an economy and something else. Lastly, they said extremism can come into other countries. This is just a ridiculous point. It's an antithetical interest to Taliban to then export more terrorism when literally they're trying to be recognized by all the mechanisms we've heard in this round. They're obviously not going to do this. Closing opposition out of the round. Quickly on to opening opposition, then I'll take POIs. For first claim, this is better to hold out the carrot and leverage for recognition, and you could not bring it back. The first thing is it's still unclear why you can't revoke it, because at the end of the day, recognition is not an end to itself. It's a means to an end. It means when you pull out your diplomats, and you pull out all people to create those communications, to do those trades, this is something that actively harms them. Jacob recognizes that this debate is not just about just a broad symbolism, but it's actually about the real practical obstacles that exist and is tied with this. Secondly, there's a time gap issue, because the Taliban is likely to see this as a less fulfilling recognition, right? They give it, like, you give it to them first, there's plenty of distrust, because, like, if you don't give it to them first, there's plenty of distrust from them because they've been fucked all the time. So they're not going to be like, I'm going to willingly do all these things to, like, actually improve as a country if you're not going to give it to them. This is the first step to make them improve, because now you're opening up the means in order to get the preferences that they actually have in order to get these types of communications to actually happen in the first place. So ultimately, that's not clear. Secondly, say there are other forms of engaging with the countries that tie to everything else. Firstly, if there's no direct financial or political interest, then it's very unlikely that certain states, especially middle state countries, are likely to give care, foreign aid, or care about this business interest. This is literally the biggest contribution that Jacob says that we do not hear of opening government. It is the fact that you are able to access this type of care that is mutually exclusive to their side of the house. And this is something that has to be front-facing. Opposition's right. A lot of open government's case is unclear about the fact that why can't we just do back channels? You can't do back channels with economic trade. You can't do back channels with creating foreign-based businesses inside your business, inside your country. So to that extent, you lose out on government actors if, for example, like some other government actor giving you foreign aid because they don't want the public perception of that happening. POI.
Yeah, so even if all your arguments for why diplomatic recognition allows for economic benefits that are aligned with the interests of the Taliban are true, those are the reasons they want it and will agree to conditions that we provide on our side.
No, but like, that's the whole, this is the first step, right? You're treating this as a weird thing. This isn't the thing that you are using as a carrot. This is the first step to get the other conditions. This is like, for example, OG said you're just going to open up the bank accounts once you recognize them. No, you're going to recognize them, form the relationships, and then you're going to leverage, like a carrot, the bank accounts with the money. That is what they want. They want their money back. So them saying that, this is why OG also loses. Like, their impact is, this is a minimal debate, and we just give money, and this is all we are going to do. No, you're not just going to give them money. It's just never give them the money back. You're going to use it as a carrot. That's the carrot. You're going to use other things like trade relations, like normalization, like being able to actually be recognized like a real country, like getting the state building benefits that Jacob points out. This is exactly what you're going to recognize as what you want. So ultimately, what I explained to you is that, like, at the end of the day, there are better ways. Like, the alternative of leveraging on our side of the house is better when you use tools that are far more approximately more important to them, and also allow to broach communication to access the preferences they necessarily want. Ultimately, then, why are we beating opening government? The main reason why we're beating opening government is because we explained to you all the different. We explained to you, one, the Taliban is not beyond reproach. We explained to you why specifically they've already gone a lot of changes. We explained to you structural mechanism as to how dictatorships still kill Earth people, which means that opening oppositions take out opening government in terms of saying that they're unlikely to actually give it to the people. But we saw the gap and explained to you why they're likely to take the people, therefore accessing a lot of their benefits. And we also explained to you why there's the real incentive state building that actually exists. Ultimately, Delta is very clear. We can't treat this like a carrot. This is the first step to access the other carrots in order to get all the benefits we want. Otherwise, Taliban is walking in the blind.
We get a huge concession from Gov, which is this doesn't really apply to the West. And I think they maybe misunderstood what Sarenna said, but I think it was pretty clear when she was like, NATO's going to cut you out. If the US is in NATO, this means the US is going to be pissed about this, and what are they going to do about it? I think what the rest of the round has failed to understand is that this recognition is not just going to affect the kind of ability of countries to trade with the Taliban or with Afghanistan, because now they're like, oh, China said it was okay, so I can go in. It's also about the ways that other countries react. It's about the ability of the Taliban to legitimize and fund itself. And it's also about the current situation in Afghanistan, which only Sarenna has actually explained to you. So first, I just want to quickly talk about the premise of the Gov bench, right? Which is basically, if you normalize these relations, they have more ability to trade. They don't give you a mechanism, but like, I'll give it to you, which is like a lot of smaller countries are like afraid of other countries being mad of them trading with countries that they haven't recognized. So when China says, we recognize you, a bunch of other countries are now willing to trade with it because they didn't want repercussions from China. You're welcome, guys. Okay, but what matters here, right, is that they say, this is going to improve the economy, and that will have trickle-down effects, and there are going to be human rights improvements, right? And that's on the margins. I think this is what Jacob tells us. Like, as good as it's going to get right now. Okay, like a few things here. First, as conceded by CG, human rights have already begun to improve in Afghanistan, absent this recognition. Why is this the case, right? It's the things that Sarenna talks to you about, right? The ability to do back channeling and things that the Taliban probably wouldn't officially recognize or be able to do on the world stage because it makes them look contradictory, for example, if they're getting like Western money and like Western like food in, but they're still willing to do and show that they are making progress because of that. I think that's the only actually clear change that's been mechanized in this round. But second of all, right, it's the idea that we're going to use this as leverage for them to economically improve. This is what we get from Friend Half. And the idea that it'll have kind of trickle-down effects because people will have more money. Okay, first on leverage. Gov has conceded the West isn't the one doing this, right? So it's unclear to me who's going to be leveraging anything, right? China's entire policy across the board has been, we're not going to make you do any human rights improvements or changes for trade or funding, right? So OG is out of the round. CG, though, has a different argument, right? CG says it's not just about like leveraging it, right? It's just about the fact that if you build roads, if you have more money in businesses in these places, things will get better for people, right? But I think this takes a really narrow look at what this is going to look like. First, I don't think Jacob actually explains to us why the money is likely to go to these types of things, right? Why the Taliban is probably not going to prioritize things like the border expansions that OG is talking about that's going to lead to more regional stability. Why they're not going to prioritize things like making sure that all of the tribes that are still dissident within Afghanistan are completely wiped out so that they don't have the uprisings that we're talking about. We actually think that the money being pumped in, even if there's some short-term improvement to you having additional roads or like an additional business in your neighborhood, is super outweighed by the fact that the Taliban now has like the money and power and the backing of places like China to completely wipe out their opposition in a way that they haven't yet been able to do because they've been okay with the regional dealings. Back up.
The simple answer to this is that money buys goods and services. So regardless of what their like big geopolitical interests are, their proximate interest is developing business and then used to fund all those endeavors, which is why they still need to build all this infrastructure that can only be done with like active trade deals and
Yeah, I got that argument, right? But my point is you have to weigh that, right? So first of all, like how many businesses are really still going into Afghanistan? Like still, obviously it's still really unstable. There's still a lot of like dissident groups and tribes, right? So it's a marginal improvement in economy, right? That's a utility win for Jacob. Until you go, wait a second, they have all of this money and backing from China, and now have the ability to crack down on all opposition and dissidents, which they did not have before, right? That is what happens in Jacob's world. So if you're weighing, you marginally have like another business come into your street, and maybe like your I don't know, amount of drinking water you have goes from like 5 glasses to 6 glasses for a couple of years, but then your entire family gets wiped out because they're all considered like Uzbeki dissidents, right? Or there's like other regional, like Taliban, for example, that the US or whatever countries recognize as country can no longer intervene on because it's seen as going directly opposed to the Taliban government, right? So it also undercuts your ability to intervene in other ways. So that's why the internal impacts actually work. OG tells us stuff about this, right? They're like legitimizing the government is bad because we're giving the terrorists what they want, and this is like symbolically bad because now we don't have any leverage. But they don't explain to you what that leverage looks like or how it's been used in the past. Only Sarenna gives that to you, right? They also don't explain to you any of the things I just said, to be honest. Okay, Front half, do you guys have anything?
Okay, Daniel tells you that your need to crack down on random dissidents is contingent on your perceived instability, which means that, comparatively speaking on the margins, if you perceive your regime as more stable because of international backing, you feel less of a need to spend resources on killing people that you think would be revolutionaries.
Oh no, but it's not, right? Because two things, right? One, I think OG flags this, right? Which is you still have a huge ideological push for this, and if you, as like head leaders of Afghanistan, of the Taliban, are not actually promoting your caliphate, I think that's where you probably get a lot of internal shifting where people no longer want you in power. But the second thing is, Sarenna explains to you why the dissidence and division that exists is very entrenched and tribal, right? Which means you don't trust that these people are not going to still revolt or like go back against you. So the increased perceived stability is not enough for you to think that these people are not going to rise against you. Okay, talk about international impacts quickly, right? So OG says that there's like a fear of US invasion. I think I refuted this in a POI, so I think we're good with that. But they also talk about how this is important for regional stability. Also irrelevant. Pakistan's an ally, I think they're okay. Next they talk about info sharing though, and I think this is really interesting because Sarenna talks to you about how this is really bad for a few reasons. One, as conceded by Gov, the West is not doing that. This is going to become a proxy conflict, soft conflict, between China and the US, right? Where NATO gets really mad at the countries who do recognize this legitimate government because it's now viewed as kind of a China-impacted expansion, right? The only response we get to this is like, oh, but they recognize Vietnam. Guys, this does not engage at all with the context of Afghanistan, right? They spent 20 years propagandizing about how the Taliban was this huge human rights violator whom they would never recognize, right? The Gov even concedes the the amount of power that has means that that they are likely to either sanction or stop dealing with countries that do recognize them, which we think creates a lot of other internal conflicts. Plus now there are a bunch of spies in your country who are probably actually limit your ability to info share in any meaningful way. Very proud to oppose.